I think we lost...
The bankers,
Who were they?
yeah, the ones that were
It was Cosimo de' Medici and that family and the Borgias. But this family, there were, I think, 11 popes who bore the name Borgia in a 100-year period. So these people were very, very well connected. They were very wealthy. They had disposable income, which was something new in the world. And they invented a whole bunch of things which God knows this city lives or dies by. I mean, like connoisseurship, patronage of the arts, and secular research projects. I mean, they were funding Da Vinci's work on catapults and flying machines at the same time that they were keeping all these painters paid and in mistresses and so forth. They were organizing archaeological digs. People couldn't believe this stuff. I mean, we have assimilated all this, but they had forgotten the classical world. And they lived in places like Rome and Naples and Venice, but they had never dug. And they'd just been quarrying the Colosseum and stuff like that. Well, then when they began bringing this stuff out of the ground, and then the Platonic corpus and all this, they just went ape for classicism. So ape that now we're this year celebrating the 500th anniversary of Columbus's voyage, which in a sense can be seen as the cherry on the top of the Renaissance mental explosion. We are still living in a classical world. We still react against classicism. The buildings we live in, the clothing we wear, our notion of how gentlemen behave, our attitudes toward women largely, our attitudes towards private wealth, all of this is classicism. And it had been dead 1,200 years before these Italians latched onto it and dusted it off and set it up. And, the modernism, in its broadest context, whatever that means, is the first movement to come along to be able to in any way challenge classicism. The subsets of the art movements and literary movements that preceded modernism were simply aspects of classicism. Romanticism, mannerism, the Baroque, all of these are like facets of the classical object. It's only in modernism. And what modernism represents, in my humble opinion, is a kind of return to the archaic. Modernism deconstructs the clarity of the Western eye. If you have to date where modernism begins, it begins with Impressionism, which takes the clarity of the Western eye and begins to dissolve it, and the linear, the columns and lines, that's how narrative was until James Joyce and Henry James and people like that showed that narrative could be broken up. Modernism is a form of primitivism, strangely enough. The people who created modernism, people like Marcel Duchamp and Picasso and the Surrealists, they were tremendously influenced, in the case of Picasso, by African art, masks and sculpture, stuff that had never been seen in Paris in 1905 through 15, and everybody was tremendously excited by it. So modernism is part of this much larger phenomenon which I call the archaic revival. The discovery of the unconscious through Freud and Jung, the deconstruction of the image, first the image seen through Impressionism, and then the image imagined is deconstructed through Surrealism, and Dada, and then finally, the concentration on the materials of art, which you get in abstract expressionism, where it is about paint. It's no longer about paint in the service of the visual pictorialism. And then all the postmodern stuff, which is, of course, just sort of running naked, screaming through the street kind of aesthetic. Yeah.
No one ever knows the stories about very, very thousands to see about what was happening to these.
Well, only this one instance I mentioned, the scandal of 415 and this guy Alcibiades, and he was fined. He was fined and given a warning. Question, yeah. Yeah, the origin. Good question. See, what happened? I mean, it's very interesting. Some of you who are interested in Heidegger may know a wonderful essay by Hans Jonas called The Gnostic Temperament. And what he's saying in there is that the attitude, the psychology of the late Roman Empire, let's say Rome from AD 150 to 400 or so, was strikingly what we would call modern. That a profound kind of exhaustion entered into the Roman psychology in that late phase. They became, a good definition of decadence is it's sophistication without feeling, And it's Camille Pallia's definition, by the way. And the Roman Empire made the emperor a god. Well, imagine the cynicism that would pervade our society if you were under state order to light candles to George Bush. I mean, we're free to think of the man as a jackass, and it's not heresy. I mean, it may be bad taste, but it isn't heresy. And the Roman Empire expanded so rapidly and took in so many different kinds of people. I mean, there were, the Jews at the end of the Mediterranean. The Parthian Empire had been partially incorporated into the Roman Empire. Egyptian mystery religions and African folk religion, barbarian Celtic ideals were being imported in, and it became and the state religion, the religion of the emperor as god, was fairly tolerant. You had to burn a candle to Caesar, but you could also burn a candle to Astarte and Thoth and Hermes and all these other people. What got the Christians in trouble was they wouldn't give Caesar his due. Even though it says to do this, they kept claiming that they had some kind of political agenda. They kept expecting the return of a political figure. The Romans hated that because they saw it as a political force. Well, in that situation then, you have to talk about early Christianity to get this stuff in context. People don't understand how shaky our knowledge of the origins of Christianity are, with good reason, because a religion wants you to believe that it's all very cut and dried. There are real mysteries surrounding the birth of Christianity. Let me just run through it a little bit. We all know, or most of us know, if you're not completely secular, the Christmas story. And it begins, and Caesar Augustus decreed that a census should be taken of all the world. and each was going to his village to register. Do you all know this story? And so this explains why a pregnant Galilean woman, 9 months pregnant, is 110 miles away from her home village in Jerusalem. We're told that they are obeying the dictates of Caesar Augustus to participate in this census of the empire. And we're told that Pontius Pilate was procurator of Judea at this time. There was no census ordered by Caesar Augustus. No record exists of this anywhere. And if this had happened, it would have been an enormous bureaucratic task involving hundreds of clerks and the coordination of data from all parts of the empire. It would have been a shtick of some sort. And there's nothing, only this reference in the whole story of Christ. Well, weird. Okay, so then you move on. The assumption is that Christ was born in 6 BC under the conjunctio maximus of Jupiter and Saturn. That places, if you believe the Gospels, that he was killed at age 33. That means the crucifixion must have been in 27. Well, there is no reference to Christ outside the Gospels until AD 71. What was happening between 27 and 71? It's damn near 50 years. And the whole thing falls silent. And then what we get AD 71 in, I think the Roman, I guess it's in Suetonius. Suetonius, who was a Roman historian and contemporary, he says in a long rap about something else, he says, Jews have recently come to Rome and caused public disturbances at the behest of their leader, Crispus. This is as close as we get. We don't even know if Crispus is Christ. We just accept that this must be so because Suetonius is telling us that Jews of a religious type have come to Rome and caused this agitation. Some people have even wanted to that Christianity was invented in the late 60s, and that there never was a person named Christ. That zealots who were preparing the uprising of 69 against the Roman Empire created a mythical figure of a generation earlier and used this mythical figure as a symbol of their rebellion. It would be sort of as if we were to get into Joe Hill. You all know who Joe Hill is? The engine of socialism is a-slippin' back. Come on, all you workers, shovel sand on the track. Joe Hill was a martyr to social reform in this country. I believe he was shot by a firing squad in Utah in 1913. Well, we could reach back to Joe Hill and make him the founder of our movement and say what a great guy he was and collect stories about his life, and we could use it to center ourselves and build a kind of social reform movement in the name of Joe Hill. Yeah. The sacred mushroom and the cross. He basically says something very much like this. I don't know about that. I just think it's very peculiar that we know so little about Christ when he had such a major role to play. I mean, take a guy like Mani. Mani, the founder of Modernism, who was born in, I think, around 320, God, we know everything about Mani. We have his tax returns. I kid you not. We have the guy's tax returns, and we know what he looked like. We know who his friends were. We know he had marital problems. A real person, you know. And yet his religion was stomped into oblivion. So there's something funny about all this. And of course, Christ is no ordinary person. Christ is the third person of the Trinity, God incarnate. This is a claim, this was an idea that had been around for a few hundred years. You all have heard of Dionysius, who most people tend to connect to Bacchus, the drunken late Roman god of wine. But the early Dionysius is a much, much weirder figure. The early Dionysius is an androgyne, always in the company of women, a god of ecstatic frenzy. And what the enemies of the Dionysian religion always claimed was, first of all, women were the major followers of Dionysius, and they would intoxicate themselves in some way, and then holding hands dance through the countryside and rend their clothing and just carry on outrageously. And what the enemies of the Dionysian religion claimed was that they became so frenzied that these women, who were called Manaids, ate their own children. This was the lie spread about the Dionysian religion. Well, the story of the birth of Dionysius is very interesting, because his father was Zeus, the hidden higher all-father, analogous to God the Father in Christianity, but his mother was Semele. And in some versions, Semele is a mortal woman, the daughter of King Cadmus of Thebes, but in other versions, she's herself some kind of a goddess. Anyway, she was one of these many affairs that Zeus had. He was always impregnating women and bearing children. And in the 8th month of her pregnancy, she was struck by lightning and killed. And she was very dear to Zeus. And when he came upon her dead, he immediately performed a cesarean operation. And he cut open his thigh, and he put the child into his own thigh and laced up the wound. And the child was born out of the wound 6 weeks later. Now, this may be grotesque and peculiar, but notice that what we have here is something close to a virgin birth. It's born of the Father, is what we have. And Dionysius was then called the twice-born god, because he was born once by caesarean section from his mother, and born again 6 weeks later from the thigh of the Father. And it's thought that this Dionysian impulse in the hands of these mystical Jews became then the doctrine of the Immaculate Conception and the whole notion of an immaculately conceived child. Christ is a type of Dionysius. I mean, it's heresy to say so, but comparative religionists have been saying this for centuries. Dionysius was a religion of orgy and ecstasy, typical of this period in Greece. Another religious system that was sort of complementing the Hermetica and developing alongside it was Gnosticism. And, I said a few minutes ago that the psychology of the late Roman Empire was very modern. Gnosticism is a very, very modern impulse. It may not at first appear so, because ancient Gnosticism is freighted with angels, demons, what we would call superstition. But if you strip away all that Baroque stuff, you come to a philosophy very similar to the philosophy that many of us have accepted really without thinking. We just call it modern attitudes. But the idea in Gnosticism is that you're on your own. There ain't no free lunch. If God did make the universe, he disappeared shortly afterwards and has no interest in you, your fate, your fears, your hope. We don't belong. Gnostics were profoundly phobic of the world. And they were either very ascetic cults or they were very libertine-like cults, springing from the same idea, which was that they did not belong in this universe. They were from a different place, and their whole concern was to escape. They are the ones who decided that the earth is an iron prison. They didn't like to have children because they felt that to have a child is to trap light in matter. In many Gnostic sects, the only forms of sexual activity that they approved of were forms that were guaranteed to not lead to conception. So oral sex, anal sex, whatever, but never sex which could lead to conception, because that would trap the light, and that was an abomination. Needless to say, these sects died out in a hurry because they were self-limiting. There were all kinds of religious impulses, yeah. Yes, he said that these zealots were using Amanita muscaria as a sacrament, and that Christ was a symbol of the mushroom, so that they could refer to the mushroom without directly referring to it, so that only the believers would know. John Allegro's case is interesting, but not entirely persuasive. There needs to be more work in this area. There is something going on in the ancient Middle East about mushrooms. It's hard to reconstruct, first of all, because the climate itself has changed so much that there are no mushrooms. But the evidence is pretty strong and getting stronger that there was mushroom use. I reproduced in my book a picture of a mushroom object, and I was hoping I had another one here, but I guess I left it back at the apartment. Mandaeanism, which is an old cult in that part of the world, forbids the use of mushrooms, which is puzzling since there are none, and they don't forbid much, but they go way out of their way to forbid mushrooms. Out of all this turmoil, it was very much like modern times. The whole Hellenistic world was awash in religious speculation. On every street corner, they were casting horoscopes and prescribing diets, and there were the temple prostitutes. So there was a whole hedonic element in sexuality. Orgy was a style in some religious organizations. And out of all of this religious foment, Gnosticism, Hermeticism, Chaldean oracularism, Jewish syncretism, so forth and so on, and Christianity was in there, but it was just one in the crowd. But with sharpened elbows and a sense of organization, it was able to slowly worm its way into a position of dominance. The real Christians, whatever that means, probably were stamped out under the name of pagans. You see, what happened was the message of Christianity was that the end of the world was imminent. This is the other thing that they were into that has also reemerged in modern times, is the imminence of the end of the world. And so for about 180 years after Christ, or 150 years, everybody just was like so stoned out on this rap that no serious organization got done. And they just waited for the end of the world in little communities, practicing voluntary poverty and, doing their thing. And then it began to slowly dawn on people that it had been a long time since the Messiah's promise. And it was kind of stretching out a little. And so then certain mentalities in that situation said, this, return of the Messiah is all very well, but I think we should get some real estate under our control and begin a vigorous building program and maybe found some schools and stuff like that. So these religions began to turn away from their end of the world ecstatic millenarianism and to see themselves as organizing for the long haul.